Today's guest is Jennifer Rogers, a statistician specialising in all things medical. In addition to her consultancy job, she's well known in the UK as someone who tries to increase public awareness and understanding of statistics. Now, in a world of coronavirus and vaccinations, there can hardly be a better time to be talking to her. But before we get to COVID and clinical trials, I asked Professor Rogers a bit about her own statistical journey. People who do the sort of things you do for a living, I like to find out what they were like when they were kids. Like, were you, as a girl, were you into stats and numbers and that? Were you always going to be a statistician?
Do you know what? I actually was convinced that I was no good at maths. And at school, I really wasn't the biggest maths fan. It was my maths teacher who actually talked me in to doing an A-level in it. And it was really then when I did my A-levels, so sort of college level, that I really fell in love with mathematics. And particularly that was the first time that I was ever really properly introduced to statistics. And I really loved the application of mathematics. And I loved the fact that you could see a data set, you could plot it, you could, mess around with it. And that was then I really fell in love with mathematics and then decided to take it on further into university, and always convinced that this was it, the last one, I'm not doing anything else after, and then ended up doing more and more and more.
Why didn't you like mathematics? Was it because you weren't good at it, or was it because it wasn't cool and what the cool kids did? Like, why weren't you into it at first?
I think I potentially hadn't found my bit of maths that I loved. And I'm a bit of a perfectionist, and if I'm not the best at something, I'm convinced then that I'm really bad at it. It has to be all or nothing type of thing. And I think that when it came to some of the more, trigonometry kind of subjects, there were people in the class who were better than me at it, and I think I just then thought, oh, that means I'm rubbish and I'm no good at this. And when I really found statistics, I got 100% in my first exam, and I thought to myself, oh, okay, this is what I'm supposed to do. This is what I'm good at.
So what were you into when you were a bit younger? What would you have said when the adults said, what are you going to be when you grow up?
Do you know what? I started out, I was actually going to do a degree in maths and German. I really loved languages and really enjoyed doing German. Went out to Germany as part of my school course. So I think, maybe I'd have done languages. Whenever anybody asked me what I wanted to do for a living, I always said a teacher. And I did work in academia as a lecturer for a long time. So I do think that there was that sort of teaching part always in me, that I always wanted to do that.
What do you think that maths teacher then towards your A-levels saw in you, or what did they say to you that persuaded you to do mathematics?
I don't know what they saw in me. Maybe a problem-solving mind or something like that. But yeah, I picked my other A-levels and I was just trying to think, oh, what can I do as my last one? So I picked psychology, German and history. And it's a real random mix of A-levels. And I was trying to decide what my last one should be. And it was my form tutor who was my maths teacher. And she just said, oh, well, I think you're really good at maths. I think you should do it. And I thought, oh, well, I've only got to do it for a year, then I can drop it. Why not? Let's give it a go. And my mum actually bumped into her in the shops whilst I was doing my PhD and said, you'll never guess what Jennifer's doing now. And she couldn't believe it that I was now doing a PhD in statistics. And they put me up on a little wall of fame in the school. So just to say, here's what can happen.
Oh, that's brilliant. So if I raked over your earlier childhood, I wouldn't have found any clues?
Probably not, actually. I say that. I was really into science and I was really into meteorology as well. I used to stand in the kitchen and do my own weather reports. But I used to collect data on the weather, the air pressure and things like that, and I'd take a little note of it. And I think my dad has a chemistry background, and we used to do a lot of science experiments together. And maybe now I think back on it, I was more focused on the collecting of the data for it than actually doing the science itself. But yeah, I've always been a scientist. My dad, when we used to, go to bed at night, used to teach us how to recite the first 20 elements of the periodic table. So not your sort of typical bedtime stories.
Come on then. Do you remember any? I've got a periodic table right behind me there. I'm looking at one.
So you remember it? Well, it's going to sound really stupid, but it's HHE, Lebeb Kanofni, Namgal, Sipsklar, KCA. That's how it is phonetically. And if you go through all of them, then you can actually recite the first
Nice.
20 elements. Really stupid, random things.
Excellent. It's still there. All right then. So you found this love for statistics at A levels when you started doing mathematics, and then that was it. Like you did it at university and things like that. Like it was just like it sounds like you fell pretty quick.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I did a maths with statistics degree. I still enjoyed pure mathematics, and I didn't want to lose that part. And I still think that the number theory modules that I did whilst I was at university were some of the most beautiful modules that I did. I always think of number theory being this really beautiful language and these really surprising, wonderful things about numbers coming out. And I'm really glad that I did that as part of my degree. But very much statistics was always where I wanted to go. And I think when I did my master's in statistics, it was really medical statistics that I was particularly drawn to. I've always had a love of medicine, and this idea that what I do for a living can help improve people's lives, improve their quality of life, help keep them alive longer. That's just always been something that I've been really proud of and really keen to pursue.
You talked about seeing a great beauty in that more kind of pure theoretical mathematics and number theory and that. Were you ever seduced by it? Could you have ever gone in that direction? Or was it always just something on the side that you thought was nice and you were on this stats path?
Yeah, I think it was more the application path. I think I probably would have been quite happy doing some engineering as well as, statistics. I think it was, any pure mathematician's probably going to absolutely hate me for saying this, but I always saw it as more sort of maths for maths sake. And it wasn't immediately obvious to me what the applications would be. Whereas in statistics, it was very clear that this is what you could do with it. And so I think with statistics, I could very much see a path as to what my career trajectory could look like. I've always been a planner, and so having an idea of what I could do and that being very clear to me did appeal to me.
You obviously rub shoulders, and probably still do rub shoulders, with a lot of pure mathematicians. Is there a rivalry or a snobbery or an attitude that pure mathematicians have towards statisticians within the field? Like, give me the goss.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to badmouth any of my pure colleagues, but if I had £1 for every time someone said to me, "Oh, I don't like stats," I would be a very rich woman. And it does upset me sometimes that I think some people don't necessarily see stats as being a proper maths, or maybe it's the poor relation of the maths world. I get a lot of teachers saying, "Oh, I hate when I have to teach my kids statistics." And it does get to me sometimes. You stand there thinking, but you know that I do this for a living. Why are you saying this to me? So yeah, I don't know. I really hope actually throughout all of the coronavirus pandemic, I think it's really shone a light on statistics and the role that statistics has in society. And I really do hope that a silver lining of the pandemic is that people may have a new, maybe not love, but at least an appreciation for statistics and see us as being sort of a credible part of mathematics.
I don't think anyone could argue against the utility and the importance of statistics, but why do you think the pure mathematicians have previously had that sniffiness about it? Is it because it's so applied and accessible, or because they think it's easier, or harder, or?
I mean, it might be some of all of those things. I think statistics is a very different way of thinking. Not everything that we do is pure mathematics. I'm a methodological statistician, so a lot of what I do is developing new statistical models. So I have to do quite a lot of pure mathematics, and I have to do a lot of computer programming. But not every statistician would do that. You could just collect data, and that would be classed as statistics. So I think there are some parts of statistics that are not as mathematically challenging as others. There's an awful lot of thinking about designs, especially in clinical trials. You know, how do you design your trial? Trying to formulate hypotheses. So I think that sometimes if you are a real pure mathematician that loves your numbers, statistics can be a deviation away from that at times. And so maybe it's seen as a little bit of a black sheep, and maybe a bit of a standalone within the wider field.
You said that you started drifting towards medical applications of statistics. What pulled you that way?
I think I've always had a little bit of an interest in medicine. I sometimes wonder to myself, should I have done a medical degree sometimes? You know, I work with a lot of clinicians, and I find myself just being absolutely fascinated by it. And there's a really famous saying that, you know, that says one of the best things about being a statistician is you get to play in everybody's backyards. And I think the medical backyard is a particularly interesting one. You could find yourself getting lost in all the different areas. So I've worked a lot in cardiovascular disease, and just having that opportunity to learn about cardiovascular disease and heart disease and, you know, heart failure has just been so incredibly interesting to me. My PhD was looking at epilepsy data, and that fascinated me. And then when you start talking to people and you realise that a couple of your friends know someone that has epilepsy, or one of your friends themselves has epilepsy, and the work that you're doing can have a direct impact on their lives, that just makes me feel so wonderful about going to work every day, knowing that I could be helping people. I remember going to a big cardiology conference and them talking about a new treatment that had been licensed, and they put my work up on the big screen, so some of the plots that I'd produced, and that was helping them decide who should get the treatment and how it should be administered. And I just remember sitting there thinking, wow, the work that I do, it actually matters. I think sometimes when we work with numbers, it's easy to just sit in our offices and plug away at our code or our calculations and not really appreciate that the work that we're doing does have a follow-on effect and will end up actually having a big impact. And I've always been really fascinated by medicine and just love the fact that I'm helping people. That being said, though, my master's dissertation was on extreme value theory, and I do love extreme value theory. I find that really interesting.
I don't know what that is.
So it's dealing with extremes, so extreme weather, extreme sort of flood levels, and so the idea is, you know, we think about statistics or probability a lot of the time in terms of relative frequencies. If you roll a dice lots of times, you get a number 6 about a sixth of the time, and that's how you work out your probability. What extreme value theory thinks about is how do you try and generate probabilities or predict something that doesn't happen very often, or indeed has never even happened. And so that's when you're really heavily relying on underlying models that give you an idea of what the shape of the curve could look like, and you can sort of then, you know, take that, extrapolate that out into the future. And I found it really, really interesting to think about that. So I did a master's dissertation, I think it was on different flood levels.
Cool. So you're predicting when the next Noah's flood's going to happen.
Exactly. And you sort of talk about it in terms of sort of what's in a one in a century event and things like that. And, you know, people who are looking at offshore oil rigs and things would use all that information when they're trying to decide where to put them and also, you know, how to build them.
That sounds pretty cool.
Yeah, really cool. Like, really cool.
Yeah. So after you've got your PhD, can you give me like the short summary of the jobs you've done and the path you followed to get us to where you are right now?
Yeah, so I worked at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine for a few years. That was my first job out of my PhD. Really enjoyed my time there. I got a research fellowship whilst I was working there as well for the NIHR, which is the research arm of the NHS. Then I took the last year of my research fellowship with me to move to Oxford University. And I worked there for, I think it was probably about 3 or 4 years in total. Once my grant had finished, I actually took on a role building and running a consultancy unit within the statistics department. And that's where I really developed a love for consultancy work. So working with sort of small biotechs, a lot of them within the university, who had new treatments or new devices or new AI models that they were wanting to develop and commercialize, and they didn't have any statistics expertise, and so they would hire me as a consultant and I would help them out with all of that. And was really, really enjoying that work, and last August decided to make the move into the big bad world of industry, and have been working for a company called Phastar since last August, and they are a clinical trial consultancy company. So we work with lots of big pharma, smaller pharma, the tiny biotech kind of companies, helping them with their studies. It might be a randomized clinical trial, it might be an observational study, helping them all the way through from designing them all the way through to analysis and final regulatory approval. I really enjoy it. So my role there is to direct the research strategy within the company. They decided that they wanted to really start investing in research because it would, put them right at the edge of all methodological advances. And I manage all the sort of smaller consultancy projects that go on within the company too.
How do you find that change of culture going from sort of academia and, universities to that different world of medicine, but also, big bucks and money, and I don't know, there's probably also a lot of more, I would imagine more secrecy perhaps and things like that. Like, what's the culture change like for you?
It was a little bit of a shock to the system. We do quite a lot of regulatory work. So, the way all our folder structures are, version controls, QC systems, standard operating procedures, all of that sort of thing took a little bit of a while for me to get my head around. All the acronyms that get thrown around took a long time to figure out. I spent a lot of time Googling every time someone said something on a call to try and figure out what it actually meant in real terms. But yeah, it's been interesting. It's been really interesting. And it's been interesting the fact that, the pandemic's thrown up all of these sort of working from home issues. And I think it's been a bit of an interesting 18 months or so, but really exciting, and I've really, really enjoyed it.
You talk about focus on research, and I've read stuff about you online, and we read about breakthroughs and new developments in statistics. I'm perhaps going to betray my own prejudices about statistics here. But what do breakthroughs and progresses look like in statistics? Because I did think the mathematics of statistics was simpler, and most of the mathematics was known. We know how to add and divide and do percentages and plot graphs. What do breakthroughs look like in statistical research? What's there to learn and find out?
That's a really good question, and it is one that I get asked quite a lot. I get asked, how can someone do a PhD in statistics? Surely all your methods are already developed. The thing is that the world is constantly changing, and the way clinical trials are run are constantly changing. So let's think, for example, about heart failure. That's where I've done a lot of my research. Heart failure, when people first started treating it, the main thing that people were trying to prevent were deaths. We wanted to stop people dying from it. It was a bit of a death sentence when people first started looking at it. As our treatments have improved, we can actually keep people alive longer. So when we want to try and decide whether or not a new treatment works, we might not necessarily be just interested now in whether or not it prevents them from dying. Because we can keep people alive longer, we might also be interested in, okay, well, does it stop them from dying, but also, or dying sooner? Can't stop someone from dying, but does it stop them from dying sooner? But also, does it prevent them from having to go to hospital more often? And as our studies get more and more complex, standard statistical methodology fails to be adequate for analysing it. So one of the things that I looked at for my PhD is sort of recurrent event modelling. So, in heart failure, it's these repeat hospitalisations. Can we analyse these repeat hospitalisations through time for individuals? Yes, there's methodology that exists for that. But in heart failure, you've got this complication that the more hospitalisations you have, the more likely you are to die. So people dying within your study is really important. And so it's, can I analyse hospitalisations and deaths at the same time in some way? And that's where standard methodology, that just doesn't exist. So you have to come up with a new way of analysing it. And so when you come up with a new way of analysing it, it's a new method. And as I said, you have to do all the background, then mathematics of how do you get the numbers out that you need. But also then, there's no code for you to be able to run it. How do we do all of that? And so there's a lot of statistics that's still to be discovered. And it really is just in response to the world evolving and the world of clinical trials evolving.
Is it using a well-established tool set and just using those tools in different ways and aiming them at different targets in the world? Or is it coming up with whole new pieces of mathematics? That's what I don't quite understand.
Yeah, you kind of use the same sort of fundamental tools. So when you're at university, you learn topics such as statistical inference, which is if you've got a data set, how do you pull out, what the average is and things like that? How do you pull out what is the effect of age on this outcome or gender on this outcome? And you learn those fundamentals, and those fundamentals are constant throughout, but the intricacies of the individual models is what changes. And you then have to sort of apply these fundamentals to these new models that you develop to pull out the different numbers that you need.
In areas like mathematics, there are famous unsolved problems. The classic one I always talk about is the Riemann hypothesis or Fermat's last theorem and that. Is there something in statistics? Is there a problem or a thing that statisticians want to be able to do that you're waiting for some brilliant mind to come up with the tool or the algorithm or the equation? Is there a deep burning problem in the back of every statistician's mind?
I don't think there is, I've never really thought about that. But I don't think there is. I think it is more that statistics evolves and it's little steps each time, and it's little steps in response to the world changing. The world of big data and AI, as computing power increases, that changes what we're able to do and how much data we're able to process. And that then leads us in a direction of where we need to go with our future research. And I think it is these sort of small incremental changes rather than any big burning questions that are yet to be discovered.
Obviously, we had this pandemic at the start of 2020, and all of a sudden, every person and their dog was an expert on curves and infection rates and flattening curves and R numbers and things like that. As a statistician, and a statistician who I know has a real interest in the public perception of statistics, do you think that all went really well? I mean, obviously no one's glad coronavirus happened, but do you think this was like people were doing it well, it was being reported well, or was it a big fat mess? Or how was it at the start for you statistically, watching the world suddenly become obsessed with medical statistics?
Yeah, it was interesting. I don't think it was a big fat mess, but I don't think that everything was perfect. For example, when we first saw the case numbers, the daily case numbers that we are so used to seeing, those plots to start off with didn't have the averages on them. So you would just see this noisy data all fluctuating, which is normal for data of that type. And I think, it was interesting to see quite early on people trying to educate and say, if you take 3-day or 7-day rolling averages, that gives you a better idea of what the curve really looks like. And you kind of saw these things evolving. There's still some things that I'd like to see maybe being done a little bit better. So, for example, when remember when they had the exponential growth curve where they said if cases were doubling every 7 days, by the middle of October we'd have 50,000 cases, and they showed that curve. That wasn't presented with any kind of uncertainty or anything like that. Projections into the future, they're not shown with uncertainty and confidence bars or anything like that. So I think, there's still some things that we could do to better communicate with the general public, but I think it's been okay. I think at some points we saw too much information, and I think we were showing information for the sake of it. So when we were in the first lockdown and we had the daily briefings, did we really need to see every single day how many people were travelling by car or by bus or by train? I'm not sure that we really did. I think one of the lessons that I hope has been learned is, only present information that's really useful and actually telling you something that is useful. Don't overwhelm people with it. But I have been encouraged by the fact that people have been engaging with statistics. There's been a lot of couch statisticians. They may not always be doing it right, but at least they're engaging with it. And it means that someone like me, I've got a great opportunity to talk to people about it and talk to people who may in the past have been completely shut down by it.
Pulling back to the bigger picture then about the media and statistics, because just before we started recording, I watched your TEDx talk in Newcastle, which is excellent, and I recommend anyone to go and watch it, and I will put a link to it in the notes. I really enjoyed it. I think it would be fair to say there was some good-natured but well-deserved media bashing in it, where you point out classic mistakes, bad headlines, bad reporting. And not only is that entertaining, it's important to know about. But it felt like the issue you didn't talk about in your 15 minutes you had for your talk was who's to blame for it? Because, it comes across that these are dim-witted journalists or opportunistic journalists who are just latching onto a good statistic and a good number for a cheap headline, and they're not telling the true story. But there was no talk whatsoever about the source of those statistics or who put them out. And I know that, and often there are companies and statisticians and businesses who are putting these numbers out to be consumed by the media. When it's being done badly, who do we blame?
Yeah, and I'm not sure I even really know who I'm blaming. And I think that's why I always sort of tee it up as I'm giving the public the tools they need to be able to ask the right questions of what they're seeing. I think that sometimes an editor will want a grabbing headline so that they get the page views or they get the newspapers sold. I think sometimes press officers are a little bit to blame. They want the newspapers to pick up their work and report about it. And so they make the results seem as sensationalized as they can to try and get people to pick it up. Universities as well, they come under so much pressure for their work to have impact. So they themselves, they want to have their work picked up because, if you're thinking about if you're going to get future research funding, well, if the last thing that you did got covered by the BBC, that's amazing. That's great impact. And so there's a pressure on researchers to have their work published. There's a pressure then on press officers to make sure their work gets picked up. And there's a pressure from, within the journalistic world for their work to get page views. And I think that it's maybe a real deep-rooted problem that we're maybe not ever going to be able to solve. And so that's why I do really like having the opportunity to try and educate people of the things that they're seeing, because I think things have got better, and I definitely get more calls from journalists now saying, we've had this press release, can you just talk me through it? So I think that there is a little bit of a change, and I do genuinely really appreciate that. But I think there's probably going to be some way to go, and I think we probably will never get 100% there. So I think there is still a space for me to give these talks and hopefully educate people a little bit into asking the right questions.
A message I took away from your talk and from things you say in general sometimes is, you're trying to equip the readers and the consumers of media with the information that they know to be more cautious. But that just seems like such a huge demand on me with my cup of tea and my toast when I'm reading the Times in the morning, to have to be second guessing and thinking, oh, is this the relative numbers to this and that? Like, I almost feel it's a bit unfair, like, to make the readers have to do this. Like, there must be another solution.
Yeah, and I mean, I can appreciate that. And, we work a lot with journalists. So I do a lot of work with the Royal Statistical Society, and we have a course for journalists. And I think we are starting to see more. The headline may still be the big relative risk, the impressive sounding figure, but you're starting to see the absolute risks now sneaking into the actual text, and the same with uncertainty. You might get just the one single figure point estimate in your headline, but if you go on and read further, you might see a confidence interval. So I think those sorts of things are starting to sneak in. Not sure they'll ever make the headlines, but hopefully they make the text a lot more than they used to.
What do you think it takes to catalyse that change, though, and to make the journalists more responsible and ring people like you up? Is it the occasional bit of public shaming, like you sometimes do?
Do you know what? I think, yeah, I mean, maybe my public shaming makes people think a little bit more. But I think sometimes, as statisticians, we also do try and award people who do well. So, my work with the Royal Statistical Society, this is my last year of chairing the Journalism Award. So we do actually award excellence in journalism, and people are really proud when they get one of these awards, and they see it as a really good thing, this stamp of approval from the Royal Statistical Society that I do good statistical reporting. And so I think maybe a mix of giving people a slap on the wrists when they do it really badly, but also making sure that we really highlight the people that do it well and use them as an example for other people and something to aspire to.
Okay, I want to ask you about coronavirus, COVID, and vaccinations, because at the time that we're recording, we've just come off the back of a few weeks of what has felt like a real glut of reporting about statistical trials, medical trials, vaccinations. This is good, these are numbers, percentages. And now we're starting to get some of these vaccinations approved and being rolled out into our communities. And I don't think I'm stupid or mathematically illiterate, but I have to admit I've been a lot more bamboozled during this reporting of vaccinations than I was when the reporting started about the coronavirus itself. And I kind of don't know what I should be listening for, or what I should be looking for, what I should be accepting, Can you help me? What do we do? I
can appreciate that. And, clinical trials are a lot more complicated than just seeing a daily count on a plot on your screen. There's all the intricacies of, they've had different trial designs, and the designs have been called into question and things like that. And it is really complicated. And I do, I'm trained in this, so I understand it more. But for anybody else, I really do feel for anyone trying to work their way through all of this, because ultimately at the end of the day, everybody has to use this to decide whether or not they want to put this vaccine in their bodies. So it's a big decision, and, one that anybody shouldn't take lightly. I couldn't believe it. I gave a webinar yesterday, and it was the 9th of November, so just a month before, was when we got the first announcement from Pfizer, from their interim analysis. And in that month, we had, interim analyses from Moderna, interim analyses from AstraZeneca, Oxford. We had final analyses from the Pfizer-BioNTech, final analyses from Moderna, and we had the first vaccine being put in someone's arm. It's been an absolutely crazy month.
Big picture, you've looked at lots of these stats and these numbers that have been reported. Are you impressed? Are you happy? Are you happy to put this in your arm, no questions asked?
Yeah, I am. I've been absolutely astounded by the results. The results have been amazing. If you look at all the study designs and all of that in a lot more detail, what they were hoping that they would achieve compared to what they did actually achieve is actually quite astounding. We've got 3 vaccines right now that not only work, but seem to work really, really well, and so much better than we ever could have hoped for. And I think that that's just absolutely amazing in such a short period of time. Yeah, I mean, I'm happy with all of the safety assessments that have been done to date. You're never going to be able to say with any brand new treatment or vaccine that there's zero risk. I mean, there's not zero risk every time you take a paracetamol, you know. Nothing is ever zero risk, but I'm confident that everything that should have been done has been done, and everything that we could possibly know, we do know. And I am confident as well that the monitoring that's going to carry on in the future is going to be very sound, and, you know, the system will work as it should. And I'm more than happy to put this vaccine in my body. And, you know, I've got 3 grandparents left who are over the age of 80 and will be in that first wave. And I've told all of them to please go get this vaccine as soon as it's offered.
When you open up one of these reports or documents about these trials, can you tell me what some of the like the column or the category or the number or the word you first look for are? Like what's the important thing that you turn straight to and you've gone, yes, or wow, that's impressive?
So it's the vaccine effectiveness, or sometimes it's called the vaccine efficacy. So these are the it tells you how well does this vaccine work. So for the Pfizer-BioNTech, we saw a 95% vaccine effectiveness. What that means is if you had 100 people who got coronavirus, this vaccine would have prevented 95% of them. So if that same 100 people had been vaccinated, only 5 of them would have got coronavirus. And that's the number that I really look for to start off with. Now, when all of these studies were being designed, they said that they wanted to be able to get a vaccine that had a vaccine effectiveness of greater than 30%. Huh. That was the number that they were targeting. If they had a vaccine effectiveness of greater than 30%, then this would be a good result. And to have a vaccine effectiveness of 95%, that's huge. That's so much more than we ever could have hoped for, and it's such a big result. And the other studies have also had really good vaccine effectiveness estimates.
30% seems really low to me. That almost seems like, is there much point? Like, do we use many vaccines that have only a 30% efficacy?
So it would have been, they wanted a true underlying efficacy of 30%. What that would have meant for the clinical trials, when you take into account, the uncertainty and the confidence bars, they were actually targeting an estimated vaccine effectiveness in the studies of 50%. That's what they were looking for. The flu vaccine, that's got an effectiveness of between 40 to 60%. There was 1 year, a few years ago, where it went down to about 15%. So, because, they do slightly different flu vaccines every year because of the different strains and things like that. So, yeah, so 30%, to me, I agree with you. It does seem quite low. I guess there is also the question of, though, if we've got something that is going to help, it's better than doing nothing at all, especially when we're in this situation.
I do agree, but if I had a 30% vaccine in my arm, I think I'd still be locking myself in my room and be scared of getting the virus.
Yeah, quite, exactly, yeah. You'd definitely feel a lot more confident about a 95% effectiveness than 30%.
As someone who works in this field, and you were impressed by the numbers, how do you explain that then? Is it just because they've just thrown so much resources at it? Did it just turn out this was an easier thing to make a vaccine for than we thought? Like, how can we explain that after all these years of diseases and things that we just can't crack, or it takes 10 years to make a vaccine, that they were able to just smash it out of the park so quickly?
Yeah, I know. Well, I mean, I'm not a virologist. I don't know the ins and outs of vaccines, but I know that, the Pfizer-BioNTech and the Moderna, that was using the genetic sequencing. And I believe that that's the first time that this has ever been used. All of that work that's been going on in the background for, tens of 20s years has now come to fruition, and we're really seeing perhaps this is, a new world of vaccines, and it's a new way of doing things. And we're just really lucky that actually this new way of doing things turns out to be really good. But yeah, you can't statistically explain these big numbers. The numbers are what they are because of the vaccines being so good. It is astonishing that, we've had 3 from 3 and they've all been really impressive.
You said when you open a report, the thing you look to first is the efficacy, and you were like 95%, you were like, oh, that's awesome. What else do you look at, though? And what do you look at on the negative side of the ledger? Is there like a side effects column or an uncertainty column? What's the sting in the tail?
Yeah, so uncertainty becomes less of an issue when you've got such a big effect, because it's so far away from that sort of 30 or 50% target. So when you've got such a big effect, you don't worry as much about confidence intervals, because they could still be quite wide and you'd still have a really good result. But I do look at that. You try and look at what are the actual numbers behind it. How many did get it in each group. What's been interesting to look at is how many people got severe COVID in each group. So they've not just been looking at cases of COVID, but they've also been looking at cases of severe COVID. Yeah, I look at the safety events. So, for example, in the AstraZeneca Oxford study, there were, 2, they're called grade 3 side effects. So a grade 3 side effect is what we would class as a severe side effect. But it's probably severe definition-wise rather than it actually being a severe side effect. So the 2 grade 3 side effects that happened in more than 2% of people were fatigue and headache. So in real terms, they're quite mild side effects, but in sort of clinical trial world, they're classed as a grade 3 severe side effect. So I start looking at, what were the safety profiles of them. So, you don't want to have an amazing vaccine that does all these wonderful things if it also causes a lot of harm. You've got to weigh up the benefits and the risks associated with them. It's not just, one story to tell. You've got to look at it, in its entirety. So I start looking at all of those sorts of things. It's been interesting looking at the different ways that they defined COVID cases and trying to then get an idea of, what might we be able to get from this study? So, for example, the Pfizer-BioNTech, their definition of a case was 28 days after the first dose. And the Moderna study, their definition of a case was 14 days after the second dose. So the Pfizer-BioNTech, because it looked at people after the first dose, it meant you'd be able to have a look at that data in more detail and see if just 1 dose provided some protection and then 2 doses provided full protection. You wouldn't necessarily be able to get that information from the Moderna study because they only classed cases of if they happened after the second dose. So I start looking at all these little intricacies and think, what could we look at when the full data comes out? That, what's going to be really interesting to try and also explore.
There's obviously vast amounts of money involved here and so much at stake for these companies. And that's not something you'd necessarily have if it was just like, something being done for academic purposes or it was your PhD or something. What sort of safety mechanisms and checks are in place for the public to feel confident that all the data we're seeing and the reports and the studies being done are absolutely legit and aren't being corrupted by those stakes?
So everything would have to go through an independent regulator, whether that's the Food and Drug Administration, so the FDA out in the US, or, for example, we heard from the MHRA earlier on last week, so the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency in the UK, or the European Medicines Agency, the EMA. So we have all these independent regulators, and regulators get involved in every single stage of a clinical trial. So there's lots of different phases of clinical trials. So phase 1 is your first in human studies. So it's the first time that a human gets it. And you're really just looking at the way the body reacts to it. Then your phase 2 is your sort of dose finding study, where you try and figure out what's the optimal dose that you can give someone whilst taking into consideration the toxicity issues. And then you have your big phase 3 study. And regulators are involved in all of those phases, and they're involved in all stages of those phases. So when you're designing it, that has to get signed off by the regulators and say, yep, that's a good trial. You've designed that properly. We're happy with your outcomes. Your sample size is big enough. You can go ahead and you can do it. Then When trials are running, there's independent monitoring boards. So I sit on a few. So we would be independent from all of the pharmaceutical companies, and we monitor the safety data as it comes in. So we're making sure that the people in the trials are staying safe. We might do interim analyses. So we might take little looks at the data whilst the study's going. And that's all done independently and just, to make sure people stay safe and everything's working as it should. And then at the end, the full results all have to be approved by regulators. And they're the ones that get the final say as to whether or not they're going to license it. Because, you can publish the results, but it doesn't mean that necessarily it's going to get licensed. All of that information has to be looked at by someone who's independent.
Do these independent regulators have like boots on the ground and referees in the room, or are they just looking at the spreadsheets that are being supplied to them and saying, yeah, those numbers check out? Like, is there someone in the room, like when they're taking the results, or you're doing random spot checks and things like that? Or are you just taking their word for it when they supply all the numbers and say, this is who we gave it to, this is what happened, this is what we did?
They don't just submit the final results. You have to submit all the data. You have to submit all of your code. These big pharmaceutical companies, they may analyze the data, but they have to have somebody independent also analyze the data. So my company, that's a lot of what we do. We are independent and we reanalyze the data. Academics get used an awful lot for that as well. So you would have to make sure whether or not they all matched up and they were all verified. And all of that gets sent to the regulators. They don't just get the final sort of spreadsheet of, effectiveness numbers and confidence intervals. They have to see absolutely everything. We save the minutes from every single meeting that's happened, and the regulators would review all of that. So they really do go through it all with a fine-tooth comb. And that's why there's a bit of a delay between the results coming out and getting approval.
I mean, I don't want to be like flippant about it, but I guess what I'm saying is like, if you put a vaccine in someone's arm and their hair turned green and their arms fell off, you might say, oh, let's not put that one in the results because that's going to look really bad. Are there ever people in the room saying, like, just making sure like the recording of the data is happening correctly?
Yeah, so, a lot of the time when these studies are happening, they're all done blind. So because people don't know whether or not people have got the treatment or not, that kind of takes away that motivation to fudge the numbers and things like that. So people are well trained in what they should be doing and things. So, and I think ultimately people, they want vaccines that work, but also nobody wants to have the vaccine that really causes harm to someone. That's negative press that nobody wants. So I think people sometimes think, it's in everybody's best interest to just get a vaccine out there really quickly. And that's not the case. It's in everybody's interest to get a vaccine out there as quickly as possible that is safe. Because, nobody wants that negative press. Could you imagine what would happen to those share prices if there was some major side effect? We don't just want to put a vaccine out. We want to put a safe vaccine out.
There is a subset of the world who are saying, the vaccine, don't take the vaccines are dangerous. I'm not saying those people are well informed, but there is that kind of chatter going on, for better or worse. What are those people latching onto? Do you know? Have you got a sense of what they've seen or what they've read or what number they've possibly misinterpreted that has led to this sort of section of the community that is not in favour of the vaccine?
I think these people who are saying these things are a little bit suspicious of the timescale, and they're a bit suspicious of the fact that this seems to have happened so quickly, and so corners must have been cut. And that absolutely isn't the case here. When we run trials normally, all these different phases, so I was talking about the phase 1, 2, 3, the designing of them, the analysis of them, it tends to happen in a sequential manner. And the reason that happens is you don't want to start designing your phase 2 study if it turns out that your phase 1 failed. It wouldn't be in anybody's best interest. It'd be a sort of a waste of time or money. But because, with coronavirus, every single day is however many deaths, we really want to do everything that we can to speed up that process. And, everybody's just been able to throw as much money and as many resources at these things as possible that people have been designing their phase 2 study whilst their phase 1 study is already happening. And those sorts of efficiencies have all filtered through.
So there's nothing wrong with doing that. It's just normally an expensive thing to do. But in this case, okay, hang the expense.
Exactly. And well, it's an expensive thing to do if it turns out that it doesn't work, because you've wasted a lot of time. You know, they were manufacturing the vaccine before they even knew whether or not it worked. Usually that's a big risk. That's a huge waste of money if it turns out it doesn't work. But because it's, coronavirus, sod the money, let's just try and get this as quickly as possible. I use the analogy of building a house. When you build a house, you could do everything sequentially, or there's some things that can be done at the same time without damaging the integrity of the structure. And that's the same here. We can do some of the things at the same time without damaging the final integrity of the study at the end of it. And that's just what's been happening. We've been throwing all this money, all these resources to try and get things done as quickly as possible, but absolutely no corners have been cut. Every single step that needs to be taken in order to license a new drug, a new vaccine, any kind of new treatment, every single step has been taken the way that it should be taken. I think some people are worried about the fact that, we don't have enough safety data, we haven't been watching people long enough. But we've been watching people as long as we would have done, even if we'd have done these things sequentially. The total amount of time that people have spent in the studies is exactly the same. Just because it's not been as long, calendar length, everybody's been in the study for the amount of time that they would be when it would normally get licensed. And one of the things that I'd also like to stress is once a vaccine is licensed, that's not the end of the story. We don't just then, let it out into the world and that's it, over and done with. We have phase 4 studies, which are surveillance studies and confirmation studies where they want to check, okay, that effectiveness or efficacy that we did see, do we still see it? And are we continuing to see side effects? If you've got a side effect that's a 1 in a million person event, you're never going to see that in any clinical trial, and you're going to need to, carry on monitoring people afterwards before you see it. There's never going to be zero risk in any vaccine or any new drug that gets brought onto the market, but everything is being done the way it should be done, and everything will continue to be done post approval to make sure that people are staying as safe as possible. And as I said, it's not in anyone's best interests to put an unsafe vaccine out.
Finally, as the professor who's known for having an interest in how well reported and conveyed information is, how do you feel this has been, this second half of the year, the vaccination stage compared to the outbreak stage, in terms of that relationship between statistical people like yourself and lay people out there trying to understand what's going on? It feels like it hasn't been quite as good.
No, and I think I would agree with you there. One of the things that's really frustrated me is we've had this sort of science by press release where we get this press release and it's got very limited information in it. And people have been filling in the gaps with hypotheses of what could happen. So for the Oxford AstraZeneca study, we had this... there was a low dose given by accident, and then we had this low dose standard dose group compared to a standard dose group. People were asking questions of the design of the study before we'd even seen the design of the study. And I think sometimes trying to fill gaps with speculation can be quite damaging or quite harmful, because we do have skeptics out there. We do have people who are uncertain about whether or not to take the vaccine, and filling the empty spaces with this potentially unhelpful noise, I don't think has really been that fantastic. I've done a lot of interviews, my phone hasn't stopped ringing, and I feel like now I've got a real role to play in this, and I've got a part to play in trying to communicate to people what is the clinical trial process, can they be certain that what they're putting in them has gone through all the proper procedures, and can they have confidence in what they're putting inside their bodies. And I think I've just got to keep pounding the pavements and really just try and help do as many interviews as I can.
Well, you've done more than your bit today. What did you call them? Sofa statisticians or armchair statisticians? I like that term. I can't remember what it was, but you said it earlier. I'm going to use that in future. One last question then. When all the dust settles and hopefully life returns to normal, what's all this going to mean for your field, medical statisticians and that? It feels like this could be a real shot in the arm for your industry. Like, it feels like it's really like a big deal now. Everyone's really interested in it.
Yeah, it is. And I think statistics suffered a little bit for a while because, artificial intelligence and data science and machine learning, they were all cool. And classical statistics was a bit, in the dark ages, and it wasn't very cool. But we've had a brand new disease here where there's been no data, and we've had to rely on classical statistics. You can't do big data analysis when you don't have big data. And right at the very beginning of the pandemic, we didn't have hardly any data. And I think this has really been an opportunity for the statistician to show their worth and really put us right under the spotlight. And I do hope that a silver lining of all of this will be that people will have an appreciation for statistics and statisticians and really value the work that we do. And maybe we'll have lots more budding statisticians join the field, which would be amazing. It would be a really good thing to come out of a really horrible and tough year.
That's all for today. I've put some links to Professor Rogers' work, her TEDx talk, and some writing she's done about coronavirus in the notes for this episode, so do go and have a look. Thanks for listening today, and please feel free to go back and listen to some earlier episodes if you're new to the show or you haven't heard them. Maybe even subscribe to the series if you're so inclined. I'm Brady Harron, and you've been listening to the Numberphile podcast.